I keep seeing something in my older patients that doesn't make headlines, but it shows up quietly in their lives over months and sometimes years. They come in describing memory lapses that feel different from the usual senior moments. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just a sense that something's slipping. They'll mention trouble finding words during conversations with their grandchildren, or they'll describe standing in the kitchen, staring at the counter, unable to remember what they came in to get. And when I ask about their evenings, a pattern emerges. It's not what they're doing that worries me. It's what they think they're doing right. There's often this habit, something they picked up in their 50s or even earlier, that feels responsible, even virtuous. And they've kept it going because it seems like the kind of thing a health-conscious person should do. But after 60, the body's relationship to that habit shifts. The nervous system doesn't respond the same way. The brain doesn't recover the same way, and over time the very thing they believed was protecting them starts to work against them. I'm thinking of one patient in particular, a woman in her mid-60s. Sharp, organized, someone who'd always taken her health seriously. She came to me because she was worried about early dementia. Her mother had developed Alzheimer's in her 70s, and she was terrified she was seeing the first signs in herself. She described forgetting appointments, struggling to follow plot lines in books she used to love, feeling foggy in the mornings, even after what she thought was a full night's sleep. She'd already tried crossword puzzles, started taking fish oil, cut back on sugar. Nothing seemed to help. When I asked her to walk me through a typical evening, she described a routine that sounded, on the surface, perfectly reasonable. Dinner around 6, a walk afterward. Then she'd settle in with a glass of wine while watching the news, sometimes 2 glasses. Not every night, but most nights. She framed it as her way of unwinding. A ritual, something that helped her relax after the stress of the day. And she wasn't wrong to think of it that way. For years, it had worked exactly like that. But here's what I've learned and what I tried to explain to her without sounding alarmist. After 60, the brain's ability to metabolize alcohol changes. The liver slows down. The kidneys don't clear things as efficiently. And the brain itself becomes more vulnerable. Not broken, not diseased, just more sensitive. What used to feel like a mild sedative now lingers longer in the system. It disrupts the architecture of sleep in ways that aren't obvious when you first wake up. And over months and years, that disruption starts to affect the brain structure. There's research now, imaging studies, showing that regular alcohol consumption in older adults is associated with reductions in brain volume. Particularly in areas involved in memory and executive function, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. These aren't sudden collapses, they're gradual changes. The kind that accumulate slowly and show up as cognitive symptoms before they show up on a standard scan. I didn't lead with that information when I was talking to her. I didn't want to scare her. But I did ask her to consider a trial period, 4 weeks without the evening wine, just to see if anything changed. She was skeptical. She didn't think 1 or 2 glasses could be the problem. But she agreed, partly because she was desperate for answers, and partly because she trusted that I wasn't trying to take away something she loved without a good reason. What happened over the next month surprised both of us. Not because there was a dramatic turnaround, but because the changes were so subtle and so consistent. She started sleeping more deeply. She woke up feeling more clear-headed. The fogginess that had been her constant companion started to lift. Her memory didn't suddenly become perfect, but she noticed she could follow conversations more easily. She could finish books again. The word-finding problems didn't disappear completely, but they became less frequent. When she came back to see me, she said something I'll never forget. She said it felt like someone had turned the lights up in her brain. Not all the way, not like flipping a switch, but enough that she could see things more clearly. Enough that she felt like herself again. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that everyone over 60 who has a glass of wine in the evening is damaging their brain. That's not the point. The point is that the margin for error narrows as we age. What the body could handle at 50 might be too much at 65, and the signals that something's wrong aren't always obvious. They don't announce themselves. They creep in quietly, disguised as normal aging. I've had other patients describe similar patterns with different evening habits. One man in his late 60s had been taking an over-the-counter sleep aid every night for years. He thought he was helping himself sleep. And, in a way, he was. But those medications, the antihistamine-based ones, have anticholinergic effects. They block a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which is critical for memory and learning. Over time, regular use of these medications has been linked to increased risk of dementia. Not in everyone, not guaranteed. But the risk is real, and it's higher in older adults. When I suggested he try stopping the sleep aid, he was resistant. He'd been using it for so long that he couldn't imagine sleeping without it. But we worked out a plan, a gradual taper, and we focused on other things first. His evening routine, his exposure to light before bed, his caffeine intake in the afternoon, small adjustments that didn't feel overwhelming. It took longer than the 4 weeks it took my other patient. But eventually, he was able to sleep without the medication, and his cognition improved, not dramatically, but enough that his wife noticed, enough that he felt more present during conversations. I think what strikes me most about these cases is how invisible the problem is until you start looking for it. These aren't people who are doing anything obviously harmful. They're not binge drinking. They're not taking medications recklessly. They're following routines that feel normal, even healthy. And yet, those routines are slowly affecting their brains in ways they don't recognize until the effects accumulate. The challenge, I think, is that we carry habits forward from earlier decades without questioning whether they still serve us. We assume that if something worked at 50, it should work at 70. But the body doesn't work that way. It changes. The nervous system becomes less resilient. The brain becomes more vulnerable to insults that used to be minor, and the habits that once felt harmless start to have consequences. I've been thinking a lot about why this happens, why the brain becomes more sensitive to alcohol and certain medications after 60. Part of it is structural. The brain naturally loses some volume as we age. That's normal. But when you add a substance that accelerates that loss, even slightly, the cumulative effect becomes significant. Part of it is metabolic. The liver and kidneys slow down, so substances stay in the system longer. And part of it is about repair. The brain's ability to repair and regenerate itself diminishes with age. So the damage that might have been reversible at 40 becomes more permanent at 70. But there's another layer to this that I think is worth talking about. It's not just about the direct effect of the substance on the brain. It's about what happens to sleep, because that's where a lot of the damage actually occurs. Alcohol disrupts sleep architecture, even in small amounts. It might help you fall asleep faster, but it fragments the deeper stages of sleep, the stages where the brain consolidates memories and clears out metabolic waste. There's a system in the brain called the glymphatic system. It's like a waste removal service. It's most active during deep sleep. When sleep is fragmented, that system doesn't work as well. Waste products build up. Proteins like beta amyloid, which are associated with Alzheimer's disease, don't get cleared as efficiently. So the evening glass of wine isn't just affecting the brain directly, it's also affecting the brain's ability to clean itself overnight. And over time, that double hit, direct toxicity plus impaired clearance, starts to show up as cognitive decline. I'm not saying this to create fear. I'm saying it because I think people deserve to know how these systems work. And I think older adults, in particular, deserve to know that the rules change after 60. That what felt safe and reasonable in midlife might need to be reconsidered. When I talk to patients about this, I try to frame it in terms of coordination, not in terms of something being broken. The body is a collection of systems that have to work together. The liver, the kidneys, the brain, the sleep system. When you're younger, those systems have more flexibility. They can compensate for each other. But as you age, the coordination becomes more delicate. It's like a door latch that used to open smoothly, but now requires a gentler touch. You're not forcing it. You're adjusting your approach. That metaphor seems to resonate with people because it doesn't make them feel like they've failed. It makes them feel like they're adapting. And adaptation is something older adults are good at. They've been doing it their whole lives. So what does adaptation look like in practice? For the woman who was drinking wine in the evenings, it meant finding a different way to unwind. She started drinking herbal tea instead. Not because tea has magical properties, but because it gave her a ritual. Something warm to hold. Something that signaled to her brain that the day was winding down. She also started dimming the lights earlier in the evening. She'd read that bright light suppresses melatonin, and she figured it was worth trying. Small things, nothing revolutionary. For the man who was taking sleep aids, adaptation meant rebuilding his sleep routine from the ground up. We talked about his bedroom environment, the temperature, the darkness, the noise level. We talked about his caffeine habits. He'd been drinking coffee in the late afternoon without thinking about it. We talked about his evening activities. He'd been watching intense news programs right before bed, and his nervous system was still revved up when he tried to sleep. The two-step approach we used was simple in concept, but required patience in practice. First, downshift the nervous system. Create conditions that allow the body to start relaxing naturally. That meant dimming lights, avoiding screens, choosing calming activities in the hour before bed. Not because screens are evil, but because they keep the brain alert. Second, address the mechanical tweaks. The room temperature, the mattress quality, the timing of the last meal. These aren't glamorous changes, but they're effective. What I've learned is that older adults respond well to this kind of structured flexibility. They don't want to be told to overhaul their entire lives, but they're willing to experiment with small changes if those changes are explained clearly and tied to something they care about. In this case, protecting their cognitive function. I think it's also important to talk about how to measure progress, because that's where a lot of people get discouraged. They make a change, and they expect to feel better immediately. But the brain doesn't work that way. Improvement is often gradual. It's not a light switch. It's a dimmer that slowly brightens over weeks. For my patients, I encourage them to keep a simple log, not obsessive. Just a few notes each day about how they slept, how they felt in the morning, whether they noticed any changes in clarity or memory. Over time, patterns emerge, and those patterns give them confidence that the changes they're making are actually helping. The woman who stopped drinking wine noticed improvements within a few weeks, but even she had days where she felt foggy again, days where she wondered if it was worth it. I told her that was normal, that the brain is still vulnerable to other factors: stress, poor sleep for other reasons, dehydration. The goal wasn't to make everything perfect. The goal was to remove one significant source of stress on the brain and give it a better chance to function well. I think that's a realistic expectation for older adults. Not perfection, not a return to how they felt at 40, but a meaningful improvement in how they feel now compared to how they felt before making the change. There's another dimension to this that I want to touch on, and it's about the social aspect of evening drinking. For a lot of people, especially those who are retired or living alone, that evening glass of wine isn't just about relaxation. It's about connection. It's something they do with a partner, or something that makes them feel less isolated. And when I suggest cutting back or stopping, I'm not just asking them to change a habit. I'm asking them to change a ritual that has emotional meaning. I try to acknowledge that. I try not to be dismissive. Because if I don't address the emotional side, the practical advice won't stick. People need a replacement. They need something that fills the same emotional space. For some, that's a different kind of evening ritual, a phone call with a friend, a hobby they used to enjoy. For others, it's about reframing the social aspect, finding ways to connect that don't center around alcohol. One couple I worked with started taking evening walks together instead of sitting with wine. It wasn't a perfect swap. They missed the ritual at first, but over time they found that the walks gave them something the wine never did: a chance to talk without the television on, a chance to move their bodies, a sense of closing the day together in a way that felt intentional. I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to stop drinking entirely, but I am suggesting that after 60, it's worth taking a hard look at how much and how often. And it's worth considering whether the benefits still outweigh the costs. Because the costs, in terms of brain health, are higher than most people realize. I've also started asking my older patients about other evening habits that might seem healthy but could be working against them. Late-night snacking, for example. Eating close to bedtime raises blood sugar and disrupts sleep. It also affects the gut, which in turn affects the brain through the gut-brain axis. Heavy meals in the evening can cause reflux, which fragments sleep. Even something as innocent as drinking too much water right before bed can lead to multiple nighttime awakenings, which interrupt the deeper stages of sleep. The common thread in all of this is that the body's tolerance for disruption decreases with age. What used to be a minor inconvenience becomes a significant problem. And the brain, being one of the most metabolically active organs, is often the first place where those problems show up. I had a patient in his early 70s who was convinced he had early Alzheimer's. He'd been forgetting names, losing track of conversations, struggling with tasks that used to be automatic. His father had died of Alzheimer's, and he was sure he was heading down the same path. But when we dug into his history, it turned out he'd been taking a proton pump inhibitor for acid reflux for over a decade. These medications reduce stomach acid, which sounds helpful, but they also interfere with the absorption of vitamin B12. And B12 deficiency, especially in older adults, can cause cognitive symptoms that mimic dementia. We checked his B12 levels. They were low. We started him on supplements and worked on adjusting his evening eating habits so he didn't need the acid reflux medication as much. Within a few months, his cognition improved significantly. Not completely back to where it was in his 50s, but much better than where he'd been. Enough that he stopped worrying about Alzheimer's. That case taught me something important. It taught me that a lot of what we attribute to aging or to inevitable decline is actually reversible if we can identify the underlying cause. And often, that cause is hiding in plain sight, in a medication, in a habit, in something that seems so normal and benign that no one thinks to question it. I think that's the real message I want to convey here. Not that aging is avoidable, not that you can reverse time, but that there are specific identifiable factors that accelerate cognitive decline, and many of them are within your control. You don't need a miracle supplement. You don't need an expensive program. You need to look carefully at what you're doing every evening and ask yourself whether it's still serving you. For some people, the answer will be that it's not, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you failed. It means your body changed, and now your habits need to change too. That's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of wisdom. I've also noticed that people who make these changes often experience benefits beyond cognitive improvement. They sleep better, which improves their mood. They have more energy during the day. They feel less anxious. Their relationships improve because they're more present. These aren't separate benefits. They're all connected. Because the brain doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a larger system, and when you take care of one part, the whole system benefits. One of the things I appreciate about working with older adults is their willingness to be patient with the process. They're not looking for quick fixes. They've lived long enough to know that real change takes time. And they're willing to put in the work if they believe it will make a difference. But they also need honesty. They need to know what's realistic and what's not. They need to know that stopping an evening glass of wine won't prevent Alzheimer's if they're genetically predisposed. But it might delay the onset. It might give them a few more good years. And for most people, that's enough. A few more years of clarity, a few more years of being able to remember their grandchildren's names and follow the plot of a novel and have a conversation without struggling for words. That's not a small thing. That's everything. I want to circle back to the idea of the door latch, the idea that aging isn't about things breaking, but about things requiring a gentler, more deliberate approach, because I think that's a useful way to think about evening habits. When you're younger, you can get away with a lot. You can drink in the evening and still sleep well. You can eat late and still wake up feeling fine. You can take medications without worrying too much about side effects. Your body compensates. It smooths over the rough edges, but after 60, the compensation system starts to falter. The rough edges stay rough, and if you keep forcing the latch instead of adjusting your approach, something eventually gives. The adjustment doesn't have to be dramatic. For most people, it's about moderation. It's about being more mindful. It's about recognizing that the rules have changed and adapting accordingly. I've had patients tell me they feel like they're giving up too much, like they're sacrificing the things that make life enjoyable. And I understand that, I really do. But I also ask them to consider what they're gaining, because the trade-off isn't between pleasure and deprivation. The trade-off is between short-term comfort and long-term clarity. And for most older adults, clarity is more valuable than comfort. There's also the question of how to talk to family members about this, because often it's not the older adult who first notices the cognitive decline. It's the spouse, the adult children, the close friends, and those conversations can be difficult. No one wants to be told they're slipping. No one wants to hear that their evening ritual might be part of the problem. I encourage family members to approach these conversations with curiosity rather than judgment. Instead of saying, "You're drinking too much," try asking, "Have you noticed any changes in how you feel in the mornings?" Instead of saying, "You need to stop taking that medication," try asking, "Do you think that medication is still helping, or could we talk to your doctor about alternatives?" The goal is to open a door, not to force someone through it, because ultimately, the decision to make a change has to come from the person themselves. You can provide information, you can express concern, but you can't make someone change if they're not ready. I've seen this play out in both directions. I've seen patients who were resistant at first, but eventually came around once they understood the stakes. And I've seen patients who refused to change, even when the evidence was clear, and that's their right. My job isn't to force anyone to do anything. My job is to provide information and support and let people make their own decisions. But I will say this. The patients who do make changes, even small ones, almost always feel better, and they almost always wish they'd done it sooner. I think there's something quietly powerful about taking control of a part of your health that you can actually influence. So much of aging feels out of your control. Your joints ache, your vision dims, your hearing fades. But your evening habits, those are yours. You can change them. And when you do, and when you start to notice the benefits, it gives you a sense of agency that extends beyond just that one habit. It reminds you that you're not passive in this process. You're not just a victim of time. You're an active participant in your own health. And that matters. It matters psychologically. It matters emotionally. And it matters cognitively. I want to end by saying that if you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in any of these stories, that's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, because recognition is the first step toward change. And change, even small change, is possible at any age. You don't have to do everything at once. You don't have to overhaul your entire life. Just pick one thing. One evening habit that you're willing to examine. One habit that might be working against you instead of for you. Try adjusting it for a month. See what happens. Pay attention to how you feel. And if you notice an improvement, build on it. The brain is more resilient than we give it credit for, even after 60. Even after years of habits that weren't ideal. It can still recover. It can still improve. Not completely, not back to where it was decades ago, but enough to make a meaningful difference in your daily life. And that, to me, is what this is all about. Not perfection, not reversal, just meaningful improvement. Just giving yourself the best possible chance to stay clear and present for as long as you can. If this resonated with you, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Everyday Health Podcast. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future conversations. And if you're comfortable, share this with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Sometimes the most helpful thing we can do is start a conversation. What's one evening habit you've noticed changing as you've gotten older?